Every sports rivalry has a beginning, all except for the world's largest cocktail party. It has three. The first beginning was in 1904, during the University of Georgia's 13th season as a program, and a season opener against a team from the neighboring state of Florida, the University of Florida Blue and White, out of Lake City. The game was a complete clobbering, with Georgia laying 52 upon the inexperienced team, a program only 3 years away from their first ever game of American football. Ask any Bulldog today and they'll point to this Macon beatdown as the first Florida-Georgia game. Except there's one small complication. The University of Florida Blue and White did not represent the University of Florida. At least the modern university. They were Florida Agricultural's football team, a college that, alongside East Florida Seminary, St. Petersburg Normal and Industrial, and South Florida Military, merged into the actual University of Florida the following year. The modern university does not claim this game because of this, well, partially at least, opting instead for the rivalry's second beginning 11 years later. The first definitive game between the Gators and Bulldogs would commence in 1915. Well, sorry, not Bulldogs, the game was another beatdown. The Gators would fail to score on a forward pass in their only trip to the red zone, and Georgia would cruise to a 37-0 victory, one only slightly less embarrassing than their 52-0 loss back in 1904. Apart from its debatable place as the first Florida-Georgia game, it would also be the first game of the series played in the city of Jacksonville, a city that had become the game's mostly permanent home in 1933. These are the official beginnings of this game. But what's harder to pin is where a series of geographic convenience such as this one becomes a rivalry. Many rivalries begin bathed in spite, or pick it up shortly after they begin, but for Florida-Georgia, it took a little bit. For decades, Georgia was the undisputed better program, winning often and convincingly against the nascent Gators. It was a relationship more akin to Georgia and Kentucky than any actual rivalry. Yet in the 50s, this would begin to change. In large part due to competent coaching on the Gators' sidelines, the pendulum would finally swing towards Gainesville, a shift that would culminate in this rivalry's third and final beginning. In 1966, the Southeastern Conference was treated to a sight never before seen, an elite Florida football program. The Gators of the mid-60s were a large departure from the hapless decades that preceded it, the fruits of, ironically enough, three men hailing from Tennessee. Bob Woodruff would spend the 50s transforming Florida into a respectable program, finishing ranked for the first time in program history before getting his Gators into their very first bowl game. After leaving Gainesville following the 1959 season, the job would be handed to another Tennessee alumni, Ray Graves, who picked up right where his predecessor left off, keeping Florida in and out of the Gator Bowl and the AP poll. Success that brought one more Tennessean to Gainesville, a recruit out of Science Hill High School by the name of Steve or Spurrier. After alternating snaps with quarterback Tommy Shannon for much of 1964, he'd win the starting job in a game against the eventual national champion Crimson Tide, nearly pulling off an upset in a 17-14 loss. He'd be made the permanent starter the following year, and going into 1966, Spurrier has emerged as one of the greatest backs in the nation. He was the most accurate passer in the country, while simultaneously being top 10 in passing yards, touchdowns, and completions, all while sitting in the bottom 10 for interceptions. His success could not just be told with numbers, though, and had much more to do with his ability to pull wins single-handedly out of thin air. Take this game against the Auburn Tigers. The Gators are tied at 27 late and need to make it down the field quick to avoid taking a tie, and in the process likely throwing themselves out of conference title contention. Spurrier would end up doing just that, storming down the field to bring his team into field goal distance, or rather himself into field goal distance, where he booted it in himself 40 yards away, sealing away the 30-27 homecoming victory, and likely the 1966 Heisman Trophy. Like that, the Gators were 7-0, ranked number 7 in the nation, and undefeated in conference play. One last game, and Florida would have their very first conference title, and a solid chance at a national title should they finish undefeated. All they had was one last game in Jacksonville, Florida. The Bulldogs were no slouch, having also gone undefeated in conference play with a small 6-7 blemish against the Miami Hurricanes earlier in the season. While their offense was fairly pedestrian, Georgia's hard-nosed defense under the tutelage of third-year head coach Vince Dooley would carry them through their conference slate, keeping their opponents to an average of 7.4 points per game going into the world's largest cocktail party. The game was expected to be one of the greats, a battle of the SEC's finest to see who'd share a title with Alabama. It wasn't. Florida would get out to an early 10-3 lead going into halftime, but as soon as both teams re-entered the Gator Bowl, Georgia's defense would dominate throughout, piercing the Gator line to constantly hurry Gainesville's golden child while mercilessly covering his receivers, leading to a deluge of desperation heaves that resulted in 3 interceptions throughout the game, more than his previous 7 outings combined, and almost half of his total season-long turnover count. Then, after a 17-point fourth quarter from the Dogs, Georgia would come out victorious 27-10, earning Dooley his first of many conference titles to come, and leaving the Gators with nothing. Where a rivalry technically begins and where it actually begins are 2 different moments in time. One is a mostly inarguable first game between 2 teams, and one is where a game transforms from a series between local programs to a 60-minute spectacle of hate, glory, and disappointment. It's a lot more subjective, but looking back, this is the game I personally would choose. A game whose stakes and unmatched disappointment would spark a fire of spite that still rages to this day. The first game of the Florida-Georgia rivalry. Dooley would end up swinging the series decisively back towards Athens, winning 5 conference titles and a national title in the process, all while the Gators fluctuated between their old place as SEC scene dressing and as serious conference contenders, finally getting their first conference title in 1984, just to have it revoked due to some recruiting violations, entering the late 80s adrift, where they would bring back a familiar face to bring them back to contention. Spurrier the coach did for Florida what Spurrier the player did, and more, winning the program's first recognized conference title in 1991 to then win 5 more across the 90s and early 2000s, further going on to coach his alma mater to their first national title in 1996. What's remembered more than his trophy room, though, is his rivalries. There was Spurrier and Bowdoin, Spurrier and Fulmer, Spurrier in Auburn's Library, and Spurrier and the Georgia Bulldogs. Decades later, that 1966 loss that ended Florida's first big push for the SEC crown lingered, and Spurrier would spend the rest of his head coaching career rectifying it. From his first year as the Gators head coach in 1990 to his last in 2001, he would put together a dominant 11-1 record against the Dogs, which, combined with a 6-8 record at South Carolina, gives the head ball coach 17 career wins against Georgia, the most of any head coach. In his 12 cocktail parties as a head coach, though, 2 stick out. One his team won, and the one they didn't. Georgia was in a slump throughout most of the 90s. In the afterglow of the Vince Dooley years and before the arrival of Mark Richt, the Bulldogs would cycle through periods of mediocrity and brief glimmers of the program they were in the previous decade. In the middle of this turbulent period for Georgia, Jacksonville's old Gator Bowl was torn down to make way for Jacksonville Municipal Stadium, and the cocktail party was moved back to Gainesville and Athens for the first time in over 60 years. And as Spurrier entered Athens, there was but one goal. Hidden within every one of these 52 points the Gators would lay onto the Bulldogs that day was an echo of that 1966 game. The disappointment, the outrage, the SEC title that never was. It was the largest cocktail party Florida had ever played up until that point, and they quite literally dropped the ball. Comparatively, this game meant nothing. And yet, when half 100 were all that were left in between the hedges, the catharsis was no less powerful, and so was the spite. Georgia had taken its worst home loss in program history up until that point to a rival they barely ever played at home, in the middle of a 4-year stretch where they'd be unable to climb above 6 wins in a season. In the midst of this embarrassment, though, was hope. Hope in the visage of a freshman defensive back, number 16, who would in the next 3 years of his college career blossom into an SEC leading DB, winning all conference honors in 97 and 98, and being a key factor in Spurrier's only loss to the Dogs during his tenure in Gainesville. The 97 Gators, either due to the departure of Heisman QB Danny Werfel or simply post-national title fatigue, were in a slight slump, having lost to LSU 2 weeks before their trip to Jacksonville, where they'd get utterly worked by a Bulldog squad who, for the first time since 1988, simply looked better against the Gators in all facets of play. Georgia's offense, through the arm of Mike Bobo and the legs of Robert Edwards, would keep their team ahead for the vast majority of the game, but it would be the defense that would win it for Athens, holding an offense that averaged 34.1 points per game across the year to a mere 17. Forcing Spurrier to throw in quarterback after quarterback to try to find any kind of rhythm, ultimately coming up short, in large part due to 2 interceptions from number 16, defensive back Kirby Smart. In the years since Georgia's cathartic 1997 beatdown, the rivalry has shifted a fair bit. The arrival of Mark Richt in 2001 would bring the Bulldogs back to their traditional spot as a perennial SEC power. Yet this wouldn't stop the Gators from holding the upper hand in Jacksonville, especially once Urban Meyer arrived in Gainesville. Yet, as the Meyer years came and went, Florida was left scrambling to find a suitable replacement, giving the Dogs a perfect opportunity to swoop in and regain dominance. Not without coaching shakeups of their own, though. Mark Richt, for as great of a head coach as he was, could not get Georgia over the hump, always a game or two short from the mountaintop, which directly led to his departure in 2015, and the arrival of a familiar face to bring the Bulldogs to glory. Kirby Smart, freshly graduated from Nick Saban's coaching university, returned to his alma mater as one of the best, if not the best, up-and-coming defensive minds in the nation, a trait almost as impactful to the University of Georgia as his experience as a 90s Bulldog. Even in his team's best season in 97, after finally toppling Spurrier's dreaded Gators, they'd drop a must-win game against Auburn 2 weeks later to keep them out of competing for anything more than the Outback Bowl. Smart knew firsthand the disappointment Georgia and their fans had felt for decades, and how to reverse those woes. The SEC East, since its inception, has run through 3 teams, and with Tennessee taking a nosedive in the 2000s, the Florida-Georgia game became many years' pseudo-SEC East championship. It was a game that Richt could not master, with many of his must-win losses that ultimately keep his teams out of conference and national title implications being in Jacksonville. For Georgia to get over that hump, they'd need to beat the Gators. After a disappointing debut season, Kirby Smart would immediately bring his program their first SEC title since 2005, a berth in their first national title game since the 1983 Sugar Bowl, and a 42-7 thrashing of the Florida Gators. Since 2017, they've finished in the AP Top 10 every single year, made the playoffs 3 times, winning it all in 2021 and 2022, and beat the Gators in all but one COVID-shortened year. And when Georgia won, they won big, with only one matchup in 2019 coming down to a single score. The Gators, meanwhile, would cycle through periods of mediocrity and brief glimmers of the program they were in the previous decade, all while their arch-rival won conference titles, national titles, and rivalry game after rivalry game, led by a man who understood how it felt to be on the other sideline. While Kirby Smart seems to be significantly less outspoken in the press about his rivals than Spurrier, it hasn't kept him from getting his jabs in. Said jabs have primarily come on the field, but a few have come in between cocktail parties, with the transfer of former Gator running back Trevor Etienne and former Gator commit Jaden Rashada, and alongside the lawsuit he brought with him, immediately coming to mind. In each move, however, is a layer of practical, divorced from sentiment strategy that is laid down thick in the press, the words of a head coach concerned solely with the improvement of his team. It's a sentiment I personally believe is true, but occasionally, moments slip through that indicate this spite has never left. It's halftime in the Georgia locker room during either the 99th or 100th Florida-Georgia game, and the Bulldogs are ahead by 24 after a massive 24-point second quarter. The Gators limped into Jacksonville, reeling from a deflating 7-point loss to the LSU Tigers, and currently look to be in the middle of another collapse. It's here where Kirby Smart gave a speech that would later on be possibly intentionally leaked to the public. In this speech, you can hear the previous year's loss to the Gators loud and clear, but listen closely and you can hear a little more. You can hear Smart's own 1997 blowout. You can hear the 1995 game in Athens. And softer still, you can hear the 1966 game that created this cycle of scorn. 24-0 was never enough. How could it be?
I still remember like yesterday. Walking out this bitch in the half. The look and the feeling I had. Looking at Tyson, looking at Stokes, looking at those guys. You know what, guys? This is our fucking year. This is our fucking year. We're doing how we play. It's 0 to fucking 0, and you make them never want to play again. All that shit they're talking, I love it, Jamar. You didn't say shit. You don't say shit to them. You just laugh and point at the scoreboard. Let me get a picture, JD, pointing at the fucking scoreboard. Don't say shit to their undisciplined ass. Because we are disciplined. And our ass still gonna kick the fucking shit out of them. Physically, I want to break them. I'm talking about fucking break these bitches on defense and offense. Let's go, defense.